You're listening to the Strategic Foresight for Asia podcast. We break down the geostrategic forces shaping Pakistan and the region, delivering foresight and bringing expert analysis and practitioner insights on the trends and choices defining our future.
Assalamu alaikum, Ambassador Isaz. Thank you so much. Welcome to our Staff Asia podcast. Thank you for joining us today. What we're going to be discussing today is Pakistan's mediation efforts in the ongoing Iran, Israel, and United States conflict. This is something which has been discussed quite a bit in the last few days. There has also been some speculation in media about what is actually being done, to what extent are the efforts being made. What is clear to us, however, when we analyze the situation is Pakistan's motivations, the impetus for playing such a role in mediation efforts. This includes in order to avoid getting drawn into the conflict. It also includes the socio-economic fallout, the economic costs that would come from a long drawn-out war, some of which has already been started to be felt in Pakistan and in the region. And then, of course, the potential for an adverse reaction, which might follow if Pakistan is perceived as aligning with one side rather than the other. So there is a lot of motivation for Pakistan to play this role. So if we could begin by talking about why Pakistan is so well suited to take the responsibility of building bridges in this particular conflict.
Well, thank you, Staff Asia, for inviting me to share my thoughts. And at the outset, let me also commend you, Dr. Aiza, and Dr. Adil Sultan of Air University, Islamabad, for your immense contribution in educating the future leaders of Pakistan. Now to your question. I think Pakistan took a principled position right from the start of this conflict. In fact, I would say even before that, Pakistan has always taken a position in the Middle Eastern conflicts that it will never involve itself and that it will play a role that serves peace in the region. And I think that was the guiding motivation for Pakistan. There were some people who started speculating as soon as the 28th February assault by US and Israel came onto Iran, that Pakistan, being in strategic mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia, will probably be forced or obliged to take a side. And I had this opinion right from the beginning that Pakistan has never taken sides in conflicts in the Middle East, because we believe that a peaceful West Asia or Middle East, howsoever you want to call it, will be in Pakistan's interest. So Pakistan has taken a role whereby it condemned aggression all around. It condemned the US aggression against Iran, but also Iran's aggression against the Gulf states. So in a way, the countries of, parties in this war, mainly Iran and United States, but as well as the indirect parties, which is the Gulf states, all have developed a degree of trust that Pakistan can perhaps be the most appropriate non-partisan forum, which is genuine in its pursuit of peace. So I hope that Pakistan can play that role, and I hope that this trust by warring parties as well as others in Pakistan's abilities will continue.
Absolutely, I agree. I think that particularly when you mentioned Pakistan has taken quite a principled response in all of this regard. I think it's been very interesting to actually look at some of the responses that have come around from across the world, and especially in our region, to Pakistan's efforts in this regard. Just a few days ago, the Indian public has been very vocal in their criticisms of their government. They've been talking about how they felt that India should have stepped up and taken this role of building bridges, of trying to create a negotiated settlement and mediation efforts, etc. And we also saw some very unfortunate words or very unfortunate framing, which came out from Minister Jaishankar in this regard. So I'm interested in knowing, considering when we look at India's self-image, India's role conception within the region, they obviously have a certain idea of what kind of role they should play, and somehow it compares to what they believe what role Pakistan is expected to play. So I was wondering about your take in this regard. How do you see this?
Well, I think Indian government under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi had already picked a side when Prime Minister visited Israel 3 days before the outbreak of the war and placed all his support for Israeli actions with no condemnation whatsoever for the atrocities committed on the Palestinian people in the previous 2 years. And therefore, it lost a considerable political credit with the countries in the Middle East which felt that perhaps India has already chosen its side. And on top of that, the External Affairs Minister of India uh, tried to deride Pakistan's role as a peacemaker. And in fact, he used a word which has a derogatory interpretation. And if peacemaking was such a bad thing, then perhaps India might consider quitting the United Nations, which has been the platform for peacemaking all its life. And even in the recent conflict between Pakistan and India, in fact, confrontation between Pakistan and India in May 2025, at the Indian request, the United States President offered his facilitation. He helped achieve peace through a ceasefire. Was it an act which can be derogatory? I don't think so. I think India is a bit, I would say, what word I should say? I think they are a bit disturbed that a country like Pakistan, which India for the last 10 years has been trying to diplomatically isolate, is now positioned itself as a peacemaker and at such a grand scale. And therefore, I think in its own a feeling of frustration, Indians are giving this comment. But regardless of what India feels or doesn't feel, Pakistan should continue to play its role, which is to strive for peace between Iran and the US, but also between Iran and the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, with which Pakistan has an agreement. And as I indicated to you in my initial remarks, Pakistan's primary objective is that these two big states of the Muslim world, Iran and Saudi Arabia, should not enter into an aggressive war. And so far, I'm very happy that the Gulf states have chosen not to enter the war, because that could be devastating for all parties concerned, including us who are not a party, but for the world economy as well.
Absolutely. The broader this conflict spills, the longer it goes on, it is quite detrimental. There's an economic cost, a social cost, humanitarian cost. And regarding your remarks about what we discussed about India, I absolutely agree, because it would seem that any country would be supportive of whatever actor is stepping up, in this case, Pakistan, to try and bring a negotiated settlement. You mentioned that India appeared to have already taken a side when it visited Israel a few days prior. And I think we sort of saw a continuation of that as well when the Iranian ship was hit. Just barely after it had left India for the naval exercises they were there. We saw India's response, its lack of response. We saw Sri Lanka step up. And even in that instance, we saw that the Indian people very roundly criticized the Indian leadership for not taking the positive or responsible role it should have. I'd like to bring it a little to what the American strategic community might be thinking. So you've also served through your career as a diplomat. You have served us in the US as well. I was interested in what your thoughts might be, because we have seen what, since the beginning of this war, there seems to have been a lack of clear objectives on part of the Trump administration. We have different statements coming out from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, from the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and then even from Trump. It seems as if the goalposts keep shifting for what a win might look like for America. But in case when it comes to the American strategic community, so you have the political leadership, you have the analysts, you have the policymakers. Do you believe that they might have a slightly different understanding or expectation for what the objectives should be? And what do you think they might consider a win for America in this regard?
Well, When the US and Israel decided to invade Iran on February 28th, they were already in the midst of a negotiation facilitated by Oman. And it came as a surprise because, according to Omani foreign minister, an agreement had been reached on the Iranian nuclear program. Nevertheless, we have since heard President Trump offer various, objectives of the war. Sometimes he would say that this is to denuclearize Iran or eliminate its capacity to build a nuclear weapon. The other time we hear him say that he wants to see Iranian regime removed, sometimes even to fragment Iran's as a country by supporting Kurdish and other elements, and so on. And since the objectives have never been clarified, I think the strategy to wage that war is also not very, very clear. And not only the strategy, but the exit strategy is also not very clear. So we all can see the lack of strategic thinking in this war, which is quite visible. Where exactly do you end the war? When exactly would the US declare victory? President Trump declares victory almost every second day, but the war goes on because it is not yet clear what is it that they want to achieve. Now, into the fifth week of the war, we see that the stalemate continues, and the fact that United States has now given an indication that it would like to have a pause for talks. That betrays two elements of American strategy at the moment. One is to buy time to build up or replenish the stocks of interceptors. Mind you, 6 Gulf countries as well as Israel have been using those interceptors to counter Iranian drones and missiles, and therefore it is quite possible that those stocks have depleted. And secondly, one hears that US is now planning to bring in some Marines and other troops on ground by occupying 2 islands in the Persian Gulf. If that be the strategy that the US wants to put its troops on ground, that my fear is, and I think it is shared by voices coming out of the United States strategic community as well, that it could be very, very messy. And Iran might become another Vietnam for the US. And if the body bags begin to go back to the mainland America, then I think there'll be huge reaction from the people of the US. Already, I hear that surveys indicate that 59% of the people of the US believe that it is not America's war and that it was not imminent. Some even speculate that this was Israel's war, which America is fighting. And so because of this lack of support from the popular base of the US administration, it appears to me that this is an act of desperation which could have several implications for the US itself, but also for the world as a whole, and particularly for the region. I think an open war of this kind will end up considerable destruction in the Gulf states, and complete closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That will be highly hazardous for the world economy and for the world as a whole. I hope that this doesn't happen, but it looks that it is headed in that way.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned in polls that have been done, the percentage of the portion of the American people who believe that this war is not America's war, it should not have been entered into. And so if we keep that perspective in mind, because of course public support is absolutely essential. We saw some of this when you mentioned the Vietnam War as well, which was one of the first wars which had a very significant documentation in the media. And it also had the effect of polarizing America quite significantly. In fact, domestic public opinion was one of the key reasons why eventually, after the third change of presidents, it came under 3 presidents, and with Reagan, eventually they decided to pull out. So it did have a significant impact on this. We also saw that a few days ago, the American administration, the White House issued or shared a list of 15 demands or 15 conditions for what they would expect for a negotiated settlement. And so, what do you think that, given all of this situation, given American domestic public opinion, given the cost that has already come up and what is expected to be the potential cost if the conflict draws out, what do you imagine might be the priority areas for America in this regard, in which I imagine that, because given Pakistan's role as a mediator in this conflict, what would the priority areas look like to try and end hostilities?
Well, yes, indeed, America has put out 15 points which Iran has rejected and put forward its own 5 points. The gap between the two positions is very, very large, because the US would want Iran to capitulate and open the Strait of Hormuz and dismantle its nuclear as well as missile program. The Iranians would want the US to withdraw from its bases in the Gulf, stop all kind of firing, pay for the damages that have been caused, and also agree for the toll that Iran would want to, or accept Iran's sovereignty on the Strait of Hormuz. Naturally, these positions are mutually unacceptable, and therefore the gap is huge. So one should not expect that the common ground would be found very, very soon. I also believe that Pakistan's role will not be that of a mediator. I think Pakistan's role will be that of a facilitator, because at the end of the day, it is these warring parties themselves which have to come to a common ground. So they may have to surrender part of their position on both sides to find that common ground to come together for peace. That may take time. I today heard the Secretary of State of the United States saying that war may continue for another 2 to 4 weeks. Well, I also cannot say as to when exactly will the war end. It could well be that one fine morning, US president declares victory and stops war. But with that, that we cannot really sort of expect that to happen that quickly. So my sense is that it will take time for both parties, and all that they might agree in the first meeting is to continue talks and to go into details at some venue. Maybe they continue to Pakistan, maybe Turkey, maybe Egypt, maybe Qatar. I'm not sure. But it is for the parties concerned to realize that this war is not serving anyone's interests. It is causing huge damage for the US itself, as we just discussed, that the public opinion in the United States is turning against the war. Israel is also feeling now the heat of war, because Iranian missiles are piercing through the Iron Dome and causing devastation on Israeli cities. The Gulf countries are particularly hard hit because they have been unable to export their oil, and they are highly dependent for their food needs from the Strait of Hormuz. So my sense is that they must be exercising huge pressure at this moment on the US to end the war. Iran for itself also is suffering a lot, because more than 80,000 strikes have occurred on various Iranian cities, causing a huge devastation there. They've lost the top rung of their leadership. And the economy of the world is also suffering. So my sense is that there is enough incentive for both parties to come to a common ground. But as happens in such situations, it doesn't work out immediately unless one side capitulates. But I don't see any side capitulating completely at this stage. So my sense is that war will continue, but Pakistan should also try to facilitate achievement of that common ground, achievement of ceasefire, and achievement of some kind of peace settlement as early as possible.
Absolutely. And thank you so much also for pointing out the very important distinction in the role of a mediator and the role of a facilitator. And Pakistan certainly has a history of playing the role of a facilitator, as we saw in the 1970s when it helped bring about the rapprochement between the United States and China. I'm interested, how do you, speaking of China, what do you think, how do you think the great powers like China and Russia are looking at Pakistan's efforts? How do they perceive Pakistan's efforts in this regard?
Well, publicly and legally at the forum of the UN Security Council, both Russia and China have condemned American aggression against Iran. They have exercised their, or shall we say, they have also expressed their support for Iran, for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iran. So they are sort of lending their weight on side of Iran. There are reports that they are also helping Iran in networking, communication, satellite information, and perhaps through material means as well. That I am not very, very sure, but that's what one hears in the open source media. So Iranians are in a way encouraged by support that they have received from Russia and China. But beyond that, I think both Russia, which is bogged down in its own war with Ukraine, and China, which believes in peaceful rise, have not engaged themselves directly in the war. It is good for the world because then that would have been World War III. So they are trying to play a role by supporting Iran and sending a message to the US that this war should be ended. I think it's a very positive role. We do understand the Chinese have a philosophy of peaceful rise, of promoting globalism, promoting interdependence, and they don't like these wars, so therefore they like to see this war end as early as possible.
So it would make sense for them to be supportive of Pakistan's efforts in this regard to bring around a peaceful settlement or to help facilitate that process. If I could just quickly bring around another question that's been going around, and this is something we're all thinking about, the utility of international forums or the utility of public forums, for example, like the United Nations. When we think of it in terms of global governance, the ongoing conflicts in the world, we've seen the Israel-Gaza conflict, we've seen the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we've also seen now this new conflict. And it seems to have exposed quite obviously the limitations of some of the global governance structures. Do you see, or do you think that we are going to be moving towards a situation or a scenario in the near future where global governance is going to come under further strain? And when I speak of global governance, of course, I refer to international law, I refer to the role of international organizations. I ask this because in my mind, I feel that even though the strain is being felt, but despite that, the different countries involved, for instance, again, bringing it to Pakistan's efforts in this regard, we are all still trying to work within the framework of international law and within the framework of these institutions and regimes. How do you think this might move forward? How do you think this might play out?
Well, the war between US, Israel combined and Iran is yet another manifestation of the breakdown of the world order that was created in 1945. Ironically, this breakdown is being led by the very architect of that world order, the United States of America. It started initially in 2003 when the US waged a war against Iraq without an express consent of the UN Security Council, and it did that unilaterally and without any regard for international law. In fact, it did that on preemptive grounds. Ever since, this precedent has been repeated, and we have seen that the world order is under great, great stress. And multilateralism is on the decline, unilateralism is on the rise, and the relevance of organizations like United Nations is now becoming increasingly less and marginal, as we can see from the diminishing role of the United Nations in matters of international peace and security. So that means that in today's world, which is a world in disorder, all countries are essentially to fend for themselves and also to build alliances with like-minded countries so that they can build up their deterrence. And that is why you hear now the talk of Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt joining hands to form some kind of alliance or some kind of coalition so that they can collectively defend themselves. Now, that kind of trend is mini-lateralism is already underway in various parts of the world. And here too, in this very war, although the US did not get support of the G7 countries or its transatlantic alliance, namely NATO, yet the sympathies of the Western world are with the US, while Iran is receiving support from Eastern powers, namely China and also Russia. So we can see that in this increasingly disordered world, the countries will have to increasingly rely on forming coalitions of like-minded countries. And that's the trend that I see apart from every country trying to fend for itself.
So this brings me to the final section of the podcast, which is that what do we think is going to be the most likely outcome or the most likely scenario? We see that it is becoming increasingly difficult for the region to sustain this. If the global repercussions, the effects are already being felt. And as we discussed, as you also mentioned, the further that this conflict draws out, the greater the impact would be and the more difficult it would be to reverse the effects of those impacts. So given Pakistan's role in this regard, all of these efforts to try and facilitate a negotiated settlement, to try and facilitate a peace process, what would be the most likely outcome, the scenario that we think is probably going to come to the fore? And also, if success, God forbid, doesn't come the way we expect, or if it doesn't come as quickly as we would expect, what might be the outcome of that? What would be the implications?
Well, there are different scenarios that strategic community the world over is talking about. One scenario is that the US and Israel continue their bombing of Iranian cities, and Iran continues to bomb the US presence in various countries of the Gulf, and stalemate continues, which appears to me the most likely scenario. Until one side blinks and some kind of peace settlement is arrived at. And the second scenario, which is more dangerous, is that the Gulf countries enter the war because Israel has been trying to instigate them to enter the war, because Israel want Iran and the Gulf countries fight each other out, destroy each other out, so that Israel can create its own greater Israel. That scenario will be highly, highly devastating for not only these countries, but also for the energy markets of the world, and could even initiate a world economic recession. The third is, and so far the Gulf countries have done well by exercising restraint in not joining the war. The third scenario could be when the US introduces its boots on ground, and as I expect, this could be extremely dangerous for the US itself, because the US could get bogged down with the war. There could be casualties, and the political costs for President Trump and his Republican Party will mount tremendously. And the midterm elections expected in November this year, I think the Republicans might have a tough time on that. And I don't see that the US bringing in troops will overwhelm Iran. Iran is a huge, huge country, twice the area of Pakistan, very resilient people. So I think that option, that scenario is also plausible, but not useful for the warring parties or the world economy. The fourth scenario could be that Israel, feeling desperate, uses tactical nuclear weapons, and that could also force Iran's hand to extend the war from Strait of Hormuz to Bab el-Mandeb through Houthis. We can already see the early signs of that happening, and it will also open a Pandora's box of nuclear proliferation. Every country will then start to want to have a nuclear weapon of its own. That will also not be good for the world. So whichever scenario I look at, this is a total disaster for the world. So the sooner the war ends, I think the better it would be for the warring parties, but also for the world as a whole. So the first option is stalemate, which may not resolve any issues because Iran will still be there, the regime will still be there, and the basic issue will remain unsettled, which is the non-resolution of the Palestinian question, and also a check on the Israeli ambition and Israeli hegemonic designs. So that will still be there. Nevertheless, that's the best option under the circumstances for the world as a whole.
Absolutely. And the conflict keeps evolving so quickly. Developments keep happening within a matter of hours. And as we keep following it, we hope, of course, collectively that the best route forward is taken, minimizing the cost, the economic cost, the social cost, the political cost, and above all, the humanitarian cost to not just all the stakeholder countries involved, the warring parties, but also to everybody else that is being affected. So thank you so much for taking the time out, for sharing your views with us on this very important ongoing issue. And we look forward to hosting you again once more in the future for a Straff Asia podcast. Thank you for your time.
You're most welcome. Thank you very much for having me.